In the scorching November of 1127, on a dusty plain in the Holy Land, a teenage boy with a rotting face sat on a horse and stared at the end of his world. His name was Baldwin IV, the King of Jerusalem. He was 16 years old. He was dying of leprosy. His hands were bandaged to hide the sores, his body was failing him, and behind him stood a pitifully small force of roughly 400 knights. Facing him was the apocalypse. Saladin, the greatest sultan of the medieval age, the unifier of Egypt and Syria, had brought an army of 26,000 men to wipe the Christian kingdom off the map. This wasn't a skirmish. This was an extermination event. The odds were 65-1. By every metric of warfare, by every logical calculation of strategy, the Crusader kingdom should have ended that day. The ground should have been soaked with Christian blood, and Jerusalem should have fallen before sunset. But instead of dying, Baldwin IV did something that defies comprehension. He didn't just survive, he didn't just hold the line. He led a charge so violent, so perfectly timed and so spiritually charged that he didn't just defeat Saladin, he annihilated him. To understand how this miracle happened and to understand the tragedy that followed, you first have to understand the sheer hopelessness of the situation in 1177. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile island in a sea of hostility. For decades, the Crusaders had relied on the disunity of their Islamic neighbors. As long as Damascus fought with Cairo, as long as the emirs quarreled, the Christians could survive. But that era was over. Saladin had risen. Saladin was a man of destiny. He was a Kurd who had risen through the ranks to become the Sultan of Egypt and, effectively, the master of Syria. He had encircled the Crusader states. He had the manpower, the wealth, and the religious legitimacy of the jihad. His goal was singular, the reclamation of Al-Quds, Jerusalem. In the autumn of 1177, Saladin decided the time for patience was over. He received reports that the Crusaders were weak, their internal politics fractured, and their king a sickly child. He mustered the full strength of the Egyptian army. His force was terrifying. 26,000 men. This included his personal guard of Mamluks, slave soldiers, trained from boyhood in the arts of war, arguably the finest professional soldiers in the world at that time. It included thousands of light cavalry, Sudanese infantry, and heavy siege engineers. When this army moved, it drank rivers dry. Against this, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was paralyzed. King Baldwin IV was barely an adult. Leprosy, the living death, was eating his nervous system. He couldn't feel his fingers. He often had to be tied to his horse because he couldn't grip the reins. Yet his mind was sharp, brilliant, and utterly fearless. When news of Saladin's invasion reached him, Baldwin didn't cower in Jerusalem. He scraped together every available man, roughly 375 to 400 knights and a few thousand infantry, and marched to the coastal fortress of Ascalon to block the Egyptian advance. But here is where the story turns on a knife edge. When Baldwin arrived at Ascalon, he realized he had been outmaneuvered. Saladin's army was too massive. The Sultan simply bypassed the city. He looked at the tiny Crusader force holed up in Ascalon and made a calculation that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided they were irrelevant. Saladin thought, why waste time besieging a few hundred men in a castle when Jerusalem lies open before me? He left a small detachment to blockade Ascalon and marched his main army north toward the capital. He was so confident, so utterly sure of his victory, that he allowed his army to break formation. This was the fatal mistake, the hubris of the conqueror. Saladin permitted his troops to spread out over miles of countryside to pillage. They sacked the towns of Ramla and Lydda. They burned churches, stole cattle, and captured villages. The discipline of the great Ayyubid army dissolved into a mob of looters. They weren't marching for battle, they were marching for profit. Their armor was packed away in baggage wagons. Their horses were unarmored. They were relaxed. Inside Ascalon, the leper king was watching. Baldwin IV was sick, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the blockade was thin. He saw the main army moving away. He knew that if he stayed in Ascalon, he would survive for a few weeks, but his kingdom would die. Jerusalem had no defenders. It would fall in days. He had to make a choice that was effectively a suicide pact. He ordered the gates of Ascalon to be opened. He ordered his 400 knights to mount up. They were going to chase down an army of 26,000. They rode north along the coast, pushing their horses to the breaking point. They were racing against time, trying to intercept Saladin before he reached Jerusalem. Along the way, they were joined by the Knights Templar, led by their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand. This brought their numbers of heavy cavalry up to perhaps 500, but still, the disparity was laughable. On the afternoon of November 25th, 1177, near the hill of Montgisard, the Crusaders crested a ridge and saw them. The Muslim army was crossing a wadi, a riverbed. They were completely disorganized. The baggage train clogged the roads. Soldiers were scattered, carrying loot, walking beside their horses. Saladin was in the center, unaware that the enemy he thought was trapped in Ascalon was now less than a mile away. The shock was total. A contemporary chronicler describes the scene. Saladin was seemingly paralyzed by the appearance of the banner of the cross. He tried to sound the alarm, tried to rally his Mamluks, tried to form battle lines, but it was too late. Baldwin IV saw the confusion. He saw the fear. He knew this was the only moment he would get. The king dismounted his horse. He called for the Bishop of Bethlehem, who was carrying the true cross, a piece of wood believed to be from the actual cross of Christ. Baldwin fell to his knees in the dust. He wept. He prayed aloud, asking God not to let the kingdom fall, asking for strength for his broken body. When he stood up, the weeping was gone. The leper king was gone. Only the general remained. He remounted. He signaled the charge. Strike! The 400 knights leveled their lances. They kicked their spurs into their war horses. The ground shook. You must understand the physics of a medieval heavy cavalry charge to understand what happened next. A destrier warhorse weighs over 1,000 pounds. The rider and his armor weigh another 250. Multiply that by 400. You have a wall of steel and muscle moving at 25 miles per hour. When they hit the confused, lightly armored lines of Saladin's army, it wasn't a battle. It was a car crash. The Crusaders struck like a thunderbolt. They didn't aim for the flanks. They aimed straight for the center, straight for the yellow banners of the Sultan. The initial impact vaporized the Ayyubid vanguard. Horses were smashed aside. Men were trampled before they could draw their swords. The Crusader knights, fueled by religious desperation and the knowledge that retreat meant death, fought with a fury that terrified the Muslims. The Templars were at the front. These were warrior monks, men who were forbidden to retreat, men who had spent their lives training for exactly this moment. They cut a path of blood through the chaotic mass of Egyptian soldiers. Saladin's army had the numbers, but numbers mean nothing without cohesion. In the narrow confines of the wadi, the thousands of Egyptian troops became a hindrance. They tripped over each other. They blocked their own archers. Panic, the greatest killer in ancient warfare, spread faster than the fire. The Franks are upon us. The king is here. The rumor spread that the Christian army was massive, that Baldwin must have hired mercenaries, that God himself was fighting for them. Baldwin, despite his crippled hands, led from the front. He rode with his sword tied to his gauntlet, hacking at the enemies of his faith. The sight of this dying boy, this cursed king, fighting like a demon, shattered the morale of Saladin's troops. They broke. The Mamluk Guard, the elite of the elite, tried to make a stand around Saladin. They fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the momentum of the heavy horse. They were cut down almost to the last man. Saladin, the conqueror who had dreamed of entering Jerusalem in triumph, suddenly found himself fighting for his life. His bodyguards were dead. The Crusaders were yards away. He realized the battle was lost. He realized his army was gone. Saladin abandoned his baggage. He abandoned his palanquin. He climbed onto a racing camel, a fast, agile beast, and fled into the desert. The Battle of Montgisard was over in hours. The slaughter lasted until nightfall. The Crusaders pursued the fleeing Muslims for miles. They cut down stragglers. They captured the Sultan's entire baggage train, his gold, his supplies, his tents. But the destruction of Saladin's army didn't end with the swords of the knights. Nature finished the job. As Saladin fled back toward Egypt, a torrential storm broke out. It was freezing rain and hail, rare for the region. The survivors of the battle, who had thrown away their armor and warm clothes to run faster, now froze to death in the desert. They had no food. They had no water. Bedouin tribes, sensing weakness, attacked the stragglers. Of the 26,000 men who had marched out of Egypt, it is estimated that barely 2,000 to 3,000 made it back alive. Saladin returned to Cairo not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. He had lost his army. He had lost his prestige. He had been humiliated by a boy with leprosy. When the news reached Europe, bells rang in every cathedral. It was hailed as a genuine miracle, the miracle of Montgisard, the proof that God favored the kingdom of Jerusalem. But here is the cold, hard reality of history. Here is the tragedy that makes this story so poignant. Montgisard was a miracle, yes, but miracles are not strategies. The victory saved the kingdom for 10 years. It bought Baldwin time, but it didn't change the geopolitical reality. Saladin controlled the resources of two wealthy nations, Egypt and Syria. The Crusaders controlled a strip of dry coast. Saladin could replace his 20,000 men in a year. Baldwin could not replace his 400 knights. Worse, the victory at Montgisard taught Saladin a lesson he would never forget. Before Montgisard, Saladin was a great politician and a good general. After Montgisard, he became a master of war. He realized that he could not underestimate the Franks. He realized that he needed to be patient. He realized that the Crusader heavy cavalry charge was their only real weapon, and if he could neutralize that, he would win. He spent the next decade reforming his army. He unified the Muslim world even further. He isolated Jerusalem diplomatically. And Baldwin rotted. The disease was relentless. By his early 20s, he was blind. He couldn't walk. His nose and fingers had been eaten away. He ruled his kingdom from a litter, his mind still sharp, but his body a prison of decaying flesh. He died in 1185 at the age of 24, a hero who had given everything for his people. But when he died, the unity of the kingdom died with him. The crown passed to lesser men, greedy, incompetent men like Guy of Lusignan and Reynald of Châtillon. And Saladin was waiting. In 1187, 10 years after Montgisard, Saladin returned. He brought another army, even bigger than the first. But this time, he didn't make mistakes. He didn't disperse his troops. He didn't let himself be surprised. He lured the Crusader army, the descendants of the victors of Montgisard, into a trap in the dry, waterless hills of Hattin. At the Battle of Hattin, Saladin did exactly what he had learned to do. He used the heat. He used the dust. He surrounded the knights. He didn't let them charge. He slaughtered them. The entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was destroyed. The king was captured. The true cross, the same cross Baldwin had knelt before at Montgisard, was taken by Saladin and paraded upside down through the streets of Damascus. 3 months later, Saladin entered Jerusalem. The kingdom was effectively over. So, how should we remember the Battle of Montgisard? Is it a story of futility, a victory that meant nothing in the end? No, it is a story of the human spirit. It is the story of a young man who had every excuse to give up. He was in pain every second of his life. He was facing impossible odds. He was advised by his own council to flee, but he didn't. Baldwin IV looked at the darkness and chose to light a fire. He chose to fight, not because he thought he would win, but because he knew it was his duty. The miracle of Montgisard wasn't that 400 knights defeated 26,000 men. That was just tactics and luck. The real miracle was the will of the king. In the annals of military history, there are many victories. There are victories of strategy, like Cannae. There are victories of technology, like Omdurman. But Montgisard stands alone as a victory of sheer, unadulterated courage. It serves as a reminder that numbers are not destiny, that the inevitable can be delayed, if not stopped, by the actions of a single determined individual. Even centuries later, when historians look at the Crusades, amidst all the brutality and religious fanaticism, they pause at the year 1177. They look at the figure of the leper king, bandaged and broken, riding at the head of his men, charging into a sea of enemies. And they see something that transcends politics and war. They see the absolute peak of what a leader can be. Saladin went on to become a legend of chivalry and power. He is rightly remembered as one of history's giants. But on that one afternoon, in the mud of Montgisard, the giant was brought to his knees by a dying boy. And that is why, 850 years later, we still tell the story. Because on that day, the 400 didn't just crush the 26,000. They crushed the idea that hope was ever truly lost. To fully grasp the magnitude of this event, we must look deeper into the composition of the forces. The Crusader army was not just knights. It was a specific type of military unit that the world has rarely seen since. The core was the frater knights of the military orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. These men lived under monastic vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. But unlike monks who prayed, their worship was war. They drilled constantly. They fought in silence. They were forbidden to break formation. In 1177, the Templar Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, was a hard, brutal man. He was currently in the king's bad graces, but in the face of Saladin, all politics vanished. He marshaled the Templar Gaza garrison to join Baldwin. When they formed up for the charge at Montgisard, the formation would have been a conroy, a tight knee-to-knee line. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Saladin's forces were light cavalry, Turkomans and Kurds. They rode smaller, faster Arabian horses. They wore mail shirts and carried composite bows. Their tactic was hit and run. Shoot arrows, retreat, draw the enemy out. But you cannot hit and run if you are caught with your back to a ravine, with your armor packed in a wagon. Saladin's army was deployed in marching order, not battle order. The baggage train was mixed in with the combat units. When the Crusaders appeared, the Muslim commanders tried to form a line, but the baggage carts blocked them. The archers couldn't get a clear line of sight. Baldwin's charge hit a confused mob. The heavy lance of a Crusader knight was roughly 12 feet of ashwood with a steel tip. When couched under the arm, backed by the momentum of the horse, it could punch through a shield, through a mail hauberk, and through the man inside it. The first rank of Saladin's army didn't just die, they were physically blasted backward. This created a domino effect. The front rank fell into the second rank, which fell into the baggage carts. The Crusaders didn't stop to duel. They kept moving. This is the secret of the shock charge. You don't stop. You ride through, you trample, you use the horse as a weapon. The chronicler William of Tyre wrote, "The king, who was suffering from his sickness, was nevertheless carried in the midst of the squadrons. And he fought with the strength of a healthy man." Imagine the pain Baldwin must have been in. Leprosy causes nerve damage, yes, but it also causes open sores, bone degeneration, and weakness. The physical act of riding a horse in full mail armor, which weighed 40-50 llbs, while swinging a sword, would have been agony. But adrenaline and faith are powerful anesthetics. Saladin's escape is another cinematic element. He was nearly captured. Several Crusader knights got within shouting distance of the Sultan. His Mamluk bodyguards, the legendary Halka, sacrificed themselves. They formed a ring around him and died one by one to buy him time. Saladin mounted a racing camel because his horses were either exhausted or dead. A camel can travel long distances over sand without water. He rode practically non-stop to Cairo. The journey back was a death march. The Crusaders harassed the rear for a few miles, but the desert killed the rest. The Bedouins, who were nominally subjects of Saladin, saw the broken army and turned on them. They stripped the survivors naked and stole their weapons. When Saladin arrived in Cairo, he told his scribes to write that he had suffered a setback. But in private, he was devastated. He refused to listen to music or wear fine clothes for months. He had learned that the kingdom of Jerusalem, despite its small size, was a scorpion. Step on it carelessly and it will kill you. The legacy of this battle is complex. In Europe, it fueled a new wave of crusading zeal. If a leper king can defeat the great Saladin, imagine what a healthy army could do. It delayed the Third Crusade because Europe thought Jerusalem was safe. This was a false security. By saving Jerusalem in 1177, Baldwin inadvertently ensured that its eventual fall would be even more catastrophic. The pressure cooker continued to build. The Muslim world, previously skeptical of Saladin's claims of leadership, now rallied around him out of a desire for revenge. Montgisard gave Saladin the moral authority of a man who has suffered and learned. And what of the 400? Most of them would die in the coming years. The constant raiding, the skirmishes, the attrition of medieval warfare. The Templar Grand Master Odo would be captured at a later battle and die in a dungeon, refusing to be ransomed. But for one shining moment, they were the masters of the world. The battle ends with a reflection on the landscape. The hill of Montgisard is now a quiet place. The modern highway from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem runs near it. Drivers pass it every day, unaware that on that ground a dying boy and 400 desperate men once stopped the tide of history. It remains the ultimate testament to the adage, "Fortune favors the bold." But history favors the patient. Saladin was patient. Baldwin was bold. In the short term, boldness won. In the long run, patience conquered all.